A band may seem like a close-knit family on stage, but behind the scenes, where there are no cameras or fans, some groups truly cannot exist next to each other. Just like any line of work, sometimes you must work with a coworker you can't stand to get the job done. Some of the biggest bands in rock know this all too well. This video looks at 10 bands with members who despise each other. The final video for a while talking about inner turmoil within bands or bands feuding with each other, things like that. This video is not a top 10, no ranking of which band had members hate each other more, it's just a list. I asked on the YouTube community page and on Twitter which bands fit the bill of a band where members despise each other, and these are the names that came up the most. Side note, I know many people will bring up Metallica. I made a whole video about some of that along with Some Kind of Monster and Saint Anger. Check out that in the YouTube card and video description. Alright, you know how these videos work, let's get to it. One of the biggest names in metal of all time that turned into one of the saddest endings you could imagine. Phil Anselmo was never one to hold back on his anger, and as the years went on, Anselmo moved further away from Dimebag and Vinnie until Pantera faded away as a group. For a band this inspirational to the metal world, it also had a massive amount of bitterness. Taking this at face value and not going over everything Phil Anselmo has said in the past, because yikes. The biggest rift came between Anselmo and the Abbott brothers. Massive drug use, arrests, nightmarish road stories, and that's not even including all the problems the band dealt with when trying to record new music. It was far beyond creative differences in the mid-90s. Vinnie Paul said in an interview years later, Phil Anselmo had gone off and done his own thing, and it really felt like we were not respected at all. He had done it before, but this time it had gone to another level. We felt like this was the end of it, and that's when we started Damage Plan. The debauchery was legendary, but the outcomes were tragic, with Anselmo spiraling out of control and disrespecting his bandmates, and there was little to no closure for how Pantera lingered on. Now that Dimebag and Vinnie are gone, we'll never know what else could have been. The Smashing Pumpkins may not have seemed like a solo venture for the first few albums, but as time went on, the name was synonymous with Billy Corgan, and it became clear that the Smashing Pumpkins was Corgan's alone, partly due to so many other people leaving the group. The problems between James Iha and Corgan were massive and continued after the band ended the first time. When the Smashing Pumpkins played what they thought was their final show in 2000, James Iha was already having a foot out the door with future plans. Years of loss, rehab, and their members leaving, while Corgan and Iha fought till the end, influenced everyone. For over a decade after that, Corgan would always hint at reunions, but other band members would argue about never being reached out to, all while James Iha was working with A Perfect Circle and his own solo ventures. Billy Corgan did not like that. In an interview in 2012, Corgan said, "James Iha, I think, is just a piece of trash. I think he's one of the worst human beings I've ever met in my life." Not kind words for someone who started a household name with you and someone you claim you want to work with again. To everyone's surprise, including Billy Corgan, the Smashing Pumpkins would return with 3/4 of the original lineup, including James on guitar. The first time it happened was a one-off performance, first time they shared the stage in 16 years, and things improved from there. Many of the biggest grunge bands had internal conflict, and some of the spats within Alice in Chains were massive. Through all of Lane Staley and Jerry Cantrell's personal problems, this was also the ongoing working relationship these two had. For a group that bridged the gap between metal and alternative while harmonizing so well, it was a love-hate-love relationship. It got as public as Lane and Jerry arguing on stage between songs when performing live. It was a constant struggle to get on the same page, whether due to creative differences, attitudes, or band members not being in a healthy state to even work together. Staley would often fall in the latter. In fairness, Cantrell was the one putting in a massive amount of effort to work around Staley's conditions, traveling, stints in rehab, overdoses, etc. The fact that the two were so distant for so long right before the MTV Unplugged performance shows, it just proves how bad everything had fallen out, but also how talented they were together. Cantrell was extremely controlling in the studio and would be screaming at Lane, while Staley was very laid back. These problems could not last. Back in '96, when Staley became virtually a recluse and the band started to dissolve, Lane gave the famous quotes, "Drugs worked for me for years, and now they're turning against me." Unfortunately prophetic. Fun fact, the Gallagher brothers have the world record for the most profanities and attempted stranglings between two brothers. Okay, that's not true, but the fact that it's believable gives credit to just how toxic the relationship between Noel and Liam has been over the years. The endless fighting, putting differences aside, and then more aggressive fighting is par for the course in Oasis. Technically, Oasis ended in 2009, however, that's only if you don't count the many other times the Gallagher brothers had brutally insulted each other and would walk out on another every other month. We know the biggest events as well, but we don't even know all the candid quiet moments between the two where they were ready to lunge at each other. Some of the highlights include in 1994 when Noel quit Oasis' first US tour mid-live performance, Noel quitting again in 2000 after a physical fight with Liam where he refused to apologize, many drug and alcohol-induced rants caught on camera, sometimes unprovoked, and it even carried into the 2010s on Twitter where Liam called Noel a potato. It truly is an amazing list. Blood is thicker than water, and sometimes I think the Gallagher brothers wish it wasn't blood at all. All I know is that back in the day, MTV had a great celebrity deathmatch lined up for these two, and it was ruined by the comedian Gallagher. MTV dropped the ball on that episode. Can we all just point out how unbelievable it is that the Motley Crue Def Leppard World Tour happened this past summer, and that Motley Crue performed it all together, and it kind of worked? I still don't understand considering how much they all openly despised each other for years. Those who have seen the dirt know what a mess the band has been at times, and the warring egos did not help. Originally identifying themselves as four misfits rising from the streets and combining their styles, the name in turn, Motley Crue, is to have many different viewpoints. As the 80s went on and into the early 90s, those opinions became vitriol. It was summed up well when Vince Neil said at the end of the concert film The End, when asked about the band's future, "We don't hang out now, we don't hang out. We go on stage, but we don't hang out. We don't go to dinner. We don't go to each other's houses for Christmas. We're not enemies, but we're not friends. I'll probably never see them except in passing." I'm only scratching the surface of this incredibly raunchy and typical 80s fueled story, and I stand by that seeing Motley Crue all performing together in 2022 in Busch Stadium was something I never thought I would see. There are some people who would classify the issues in Guns N' Roses between Axl Rose and Slash, but I'm gonna go one further and claim that Axl Rose really had issues with just about every other band member in Guns N' Roses from the 80s all the way through the Chinese Democracy days. Guns N' Roses is synonymous with Axl, and when you hear Axl's name, you think of him blowing a gasket. Being difficult is probably putting it lightly. It ranges from Slash leaving the band in '96, which was a massive loss for GNR, but also continues when everyone from Izzy to Duff to Buckethead to so many more who all had problems working with Rose. Steven Adler once said, "He's insane. That's it. The bottom line. The man's insane. I said it. He's insane. I try to be so cool about him. I swear to God, he's a nutball." After Chinese Democracy was released, Axl said, "Personally, I consider Slash a cancer and better removed, avoided, and the less anyone heard of him or his supporters, the better." There are so many of these quotes over the years, it's hard to keep up, and it's harder still to comprehend that Guns N' Roses has been touring again the last few years with Slash and Duff back with Axl. Most of the original lineup is together, and they have been working together for years and even worked on some old material to release. Maybe Slash has calmed down with age. Maybe Axl, but probably not. As big of a deal Van Halen was through the 80s, it was also well known how outlandish and brash David Lee Roth was. When you have a mastermind in Eddie Van Halen writing the music and trying to make something deep and expansive, while David Lee Roth was determined to make everything big and flashy, you get a lot of disagreements, then arguments, then one of the biggest breakups ever. Say what you want about Van Halen continuing with Hagar, but Van Halen was massive in the early 80s, and a singer leaving like that or getting kicked out, depending on who you ask, it was earth-shattering, and it was because two wildly different personalities could not stay on the same page. A great way to describe the attitude toward this and the personality clash came from Eddie. "I'm a musician, Dave's a rock star." That quote can be seen as a standard viewpoint, an insult, whatever, but it does highlight how the two would approach music differently. The infighting and arguments went for years, and it was all around 1984 when the DLR train was going off the rails. The name-calling and legit laughing at each other between Roth and Van Halen went on for years, but it would eventually come full circle again, and after many changes for both men. It's good there was some reconciliation over the years before Eddie passed away. It takes a lot of tenacity to work through your problems, and then you have whatever Fleetwood Mac had because they had so much awful discontent and hurt with each other, and to go on and work together as a group is mind-boggling. I would try to list off all the backstabbing, affairs, and revenge that Fleetwood Mac went through over the years, but that would make this video roughly 2 hours long. Some people say success can drive a person insane, and with Fleetwood Mac, that was a lot of insanity. When the band formed, you had John and Christine married to each other, and even after an awful divorce, they still stayed in the band. You had the many affairs with band members, including Stevie Nicks, Lindsey Buckingham, Mick Fleetwood, all starting relationships with people working in the band, or even in the band at certain times, All that led to a lot of heartbreak. Add massive amounts of drugs and alcohol for years, and you have a recipe for disaster, and oddly the recipe for Rumors, one of the greatest albums of all time. Even when Fleetwood Mac was having physical fights and throwing alcohol bottles at each other, screaming matches in hotels, you name it, Rumors came out, and with that, some of the most personal and biting songs ever, and everyone had to help play songs about themselves and how awful they were to each other. This group was so talented that even all that could not stop them. The Fab Four were not always fab with each other. The reasons why the Beatles weren't a band longer than a decade was because Liverpool's favorite group could not function together after a while, especially Paul McCartney and John Lennon. The stories of the Beatles are legendary and well documented, and it's amazing we got so much music from the Beatles considering how tumultuous it was between John and Paul. It was in the Abbey Road days that John and Paul were becoming hostile with each other about how the band was sounding. The studio process, songs and albums, anything you can imagine. Throw in the love of John's life, Yoko Ono, and how he demanded everyone allow her in studio sessions, have Paul try to take control of every detail to the point of micromanagement and treating everyone in the band like employees, and you have a professional mess. The biggest band in the world, arguably of all time, became fed up with each other. Lennon announced he was leaving in 1969. After the official breakup in 1970 and following a lawsuit by McCartney suing the other band members to dissolve the Beatles, the mudslinging came and songs were written about how awful both people thought each other were. Lennon wrote How Do You Sleep in 1971, which was straight up nasty toward McCartney. Peace was not made until years later when legal actions were stopped and both McCartney and Lennon stopped trying to claim sole writing credits in old Beatles songs. It was a short-lived peace in hindsight with the world losing Lennon in 1980. The legend of Pink Floyd is storied, memorable, spans decades, and at times is quite ugly. There's no nice way to put it. While some of the tragic events in Pink Floyd's history were in no way their fault, it cannot be stressed enough that the reason Pink Floyd did not continue longer was the absolute inability of Roger Waters and David Gilmour to work together, and that's a shame. The dynamic of two lead singers and creative minds trying to write for extremely in-depth music was going to lead to heads clashing. Some called it a power struggle, some called it different personality types, but regardless of the reason, Pink Floyd changed forever when Roger Waters left in 1985 and tried to make sure no Pink Floyd music would ever be played under that name again. In 1986, a vicious lawsuit came, and the fact that even one-off reunion shows would happen years later sounded impossible back then. Roger Waters would later admit he wishes he wouldn't have gone straight to litigious actions, but what's done is done, and the bitter relationship for many years still is at the center of some of the best rock albums of all time. To quote David Gilmour on The Aftermath, the thought of him coming into something that was any form of democracy to it, he just wouldn't be good at that. Besides, I was in my 30s when Roger left the group. I'm 68 now. It's over half a lifetime away. We really don't have that much in common anymore. Pink Floyd's legacy is deep and not just the music. It's sad how things ended, but it's still great they happened at all. And that was a look at 10 bands with members who could not work together. Know of another band with inner conflict? Leave a comment and let everyone know. Big thanks to my patrons and special thanks to Chris Doman and Dom Noble. You can have a say in upcoming videos, get weekly new music playlists, and see videos early by supporting Rocked on Patreon. Click the link in the video description for more info on helping the channel. Please subscribe and ring the bell to get notified of upcoming videos, and you can keep up to date with Rocked on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Friendly reminder about the YouTube card video talking about Saint Anger and the hostile drama that happened with Metallica in the early 2000s.